Good evening. You look more nervous than I am. Good evening. It's an absolute joy and a privilege to see all of you here. Thank you for taking the time in the midst of the week, in the midst of all of your busy schedules to say, let's come and celebrate this new book, but also 15 years of the privilege of serving Sri Lanka Unites. It's been a long journey, it's been a memorable journey, but the time has come for a new season. And so I've been asked to speak twice today. This is regarding the book. I'll talk about Sri Lanka Unites at the end. So if you're asking the question, why did you want to write this book? I have some slides that I would like to take you and share some of my findings as a result of it. First of all, when one of my main inspirations was my mother, Ophelia Devisa. She went to be with her maker in heaven around 6 months ago. And throughout my life, she always told me, Prashant, do your very best in whatever you do and leave the rest to God. Do your very best. And all my life, I tried to do what I can to make my parents proud. I worked hard as a student, as an athlete, as a student leader, or whatever I got. My mom always said, I don't care how impressive it is, as long as you can look me in the eye and you can tell me you did your best. And so even with Sri Lanka Unites, I gave it my best. 15 years as a full-time volunteer, working 4 other jobs to pay the bills and doing this, traveling around the country. And I told my mom every day, I'm giving my best. I'm not giving a half effort here. But there was one thing as I reflected that I hadn't given my best, is to take the time to document the learnings that I had over the years, the experiences, the failures, and also identifying how can young people really bring about a change. Is it really possible? Are we just romanticizing youth here? And as she talked, I just remembered I didn't do my best when it came to documenting. And finally I decided, all these manuscripts of writing and notes over the years, it's time to sit down and write it. And 3 months after her passing, I was able to complete the book. And this is dedicated to her. So that was my big why. And I know she's watching from heaven, and this is to tell her, Mom, I completed this as well, and there's much more to come. Second reason, the why, as to why I started writing this, is I had the next slide please. I had the privilege of doing my master's at the University of Notre Dame in the Kroc Institute for Peace Studies. This is one of the premier schools for peace building and the development work, and I was privileged to be a student there. The first week of college or grad school, we were given all our text for the whole year, all the authors, all the books, we had it in front of us. And I raised my hand and I asked my professor, Professor, all these books are written by Westerners. All these books are written by people in the global north. But there's nothing from our part of the world. And he looked at me and said, no one's ever asked me that question. And I realized that's true. I said, Professor, most of these conflicts, the violence, the civil wars, high levels of corruption and poverty and all these difficulties are happening in the global south. How can we assume that the solutions are going to come from a place where there hasn't been a civil war in hundreds of years? It has to have more voices from the midst of the conflict writing that. And then he looked at me and said, son, maybe you should start thinking of writing. And that was the beginning when I started thinking that obviously there are plenty of writers, maybe not as much as in the Western world, but we need to start looking at solutions from within our nations. How do we bring about change? I started asking these questions, and that led me on this journey. And I was also inspired. There are many other authors, and some of our traditions are very oral traditions. And it's important that if we want our generations to succeed, overcome some of the challenges, we need to sit down, reflect and write and strategize and figure out how do we bring about sustainable change to the challenges of our time. At the same time, when you may ask me the question, Prashant, do you really believe that change is possible? Do you really believe, like this mythology, that as a phoenix rises from the ashes, that a new generation can rise and transform nations? Is there any hope for our nations? You're talking about Congo, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Myanmar. It seems helpless, hopeless. There is no hope. I beg to differ. And there are two reasons as to why this book goes into it. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you everything in the book, but I'll leave you with these two reasons. Number one, it has been done. Despite insurmountable odds, there have been generations, mainly of young people, who've looked those odds right in the eye and say, we will transform. One of these examples is William Wilberforce and the abolition movement in England. Slavery was the most lucrative industry at the time. It was impossible to even imagine that they would abolish slavery. In fact, when Wilberforce, as a young man, went into Parliament and tried to bring a bill to abolish slavery, they laughed at him and they looked at him as a traitor. But they continued a grassroots movement with freed slaves and others who had a conscience on the issue, and they awoke the conscience of a nation against slavery. And slavery was abolished in their lifetime, despite the insurmountable odds. Gandhi and the independence movement, it seemed impossible. They were outgunned, out-strategized, out-financed by the empire. There was no way that there would be an India with Indian rule. But a grassroots movement began. What seemed impossible, within decades, in 2 decades, they turned the tide around. And they had independence, which will pave the way for independence in our land as well. If you look at the suffragette movement, women were not allowed to vote, leave alone run for office, because they were considered not capable to lead, not able to distinguish in leadership. And therefore, women were not given the right to vote. But women in England and the United States started the suffragette movement. And that movement led to the right to franchise. It seemed impossible. There was no chance. But they made it possible from a grassroots movement. Today, every nation, in 2015, I believe Saudi Arabia also gave the right for women to vote. What seemed impossible was made possible. Grassroots movements. These were not people in places of power. They didn't have wealth. They didn't have overwhelming influence. These were ordinary people with an extraordinary conviction to change the realities of their nation. The same is true with the civil rights movement with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. The civil rights movement seemed hopeless. Many African Americans used to criticize Dr. King, saying, this is impossible, don't give hope to our people. And hope is exactly what he gave. And despite the overwhelming odds, there were major progression in the civil rights movement. The same is true with Mandela. People said there'll never be an African rule in South Africa. But Mandela and the African National Congress led the way. Despite the insurmountable odds, they brought change. I'm not talking about examples 1,000 years ago. These are all within 200 years, 60 years, 75 years. It has been done. And this book explores how each of these movements brought about change. How, though the odds were stacked against them, they made that difference. It has been done, it can be done. Now, you can't get lightning in a bottle, but you can reverse engineer certain things and figure out what were the key ingredients that made this work. How did they turn the tide? And that's the exploration that I've taken. I'll let you read and see what that's about. The second reason I believe that change is truly possible is not just because it's a historical fact, it has been done, but also because I believe local young leaders who were born into poverty, corruption, violence, are sick and tired of this existence, and they want to bring about change. They're willing to stand up for change. I've had the privilege of spending time in Congo and in countries like Liberia, Sierra Leone, Myanmar, all these, Afghanistan, and I look into the eyes of young people and they know that there's something better. They know they deserve better, and they're willing to take the risk to bring about change. What if we invest in them? What if we inspire them? What if we create a platform for them? They would do the unthinkable. And I truly believe that. If a young person in our country a few years ago would believe that strapping a bomb around their waist and blowing themselves up was the way that they might have justice and freedom, if they were willing to make that kind of commitment for a flawed end goal, just imagine that same potential is there for young people to bring about true, transformative, nonviolent change. We can make that happen. We need to guide them. Today's terrorist or today's violent criminal is yesterday's young person who was looking for a mentor, a role model, a platform, a place to thrive. We can provide that. Too often our politicians are not focusing on youth. Our corporate world is not focusing on youth because that's not where the money is being spent. Politicians don't care because that's not where the votes are coming from. But terrorists, extremists, gangs, and violent groups spend 100% of their attention on youth. And guess where young people go? To where they receive attention. What if we change the odds in moderate society and youth and children become our ultimate focus, not just lip service, but we really invest our lives in them? We could see changes in our society. So that's what I believe. But then why are some movements, grassroots movements, successful and others not? The next slide. And I've found these 4 key ingredients are crucial for change to happen. We've seen the Arab Springs, we've seen certain other movements come and show so much potential, but they didn't deliver long-term sustainable change. And when you ask the question, why not? Throughout history, and I've been studying 200 years of grassroots movements around the world for a long time, saying, is this possible? I wouldn't commit 15 years of my life to do this work if I didn't think we can bring about change. I'm crazy, but I'm not that crazy. There's a science here. You can make it work. You need engaged individuals. You don't need 100% of the population to believe change is possible and start working. At least 5%. Dr. Erica Chenoweth from Harvard University has done research to find if there's 5% of a population committed to bring about change in a society, you start seeing the pendulum shift. Engaged individuals. That's what we saw in the Aragulia. There was an engagement. It was not 100% of the population, 5% of the population engaged, committed to see change. Then you need political opportunity. A situation that finally things come. There is a weakness in the establishment. There is a vulnerability, and these engaged individuals pounce on that opportunity to bring about change and break the flawed systems and create transformation. You have to wait for the political opportunity, or you have to work at creating that opportunity for these movements to succeed. And thirdly, you need an organizational structure. Unfortunately, many grassroots movements don't have structure, don't have systems, don't have plans. It's a lot of emotional hippie stuff that doesn't bring about change. You need to have the structures in place. You need to be the change you want to see. So you have to have systems. You have to have accountability. You have to have key performance indicators. You have to be on course in order to bring change. Most movements that fail is because they didn't have the organization structure. They thought they'll wing it. Arab Springs thought, let's get rid of the dictator, let's bring it, and everything's going to be fine. But they couldn't replace the structure that they were bringing down with good, positive structures. That's why now the second phase of the Aragulia in Sri Lanka is young people bringing in new structure and replacing the old structure. It's not just saying, get out, here's the alternative, and here's what we're providing. That relieves room for true change. But finally, a focus, purpose narrative. I made this word up. But it's not just a clear narrative, but people need to understand why. What is this movement about? What do you want to change? Whether it's the Gandhian movement or Dr. King or the suffragette movement, they very clearly knew their why. And they didn't go trying to address every issue under the sun. They focused on that till they brought about change. So I believe it's possible. And the most beautiful thing is, I believe it's possible from the bottom up. I believe that young people in these contexts are like diamonds in the rough. They're there waiting to bring about change. And that's what I believe in. Recently I was on a flight and somebody asked me, son, what do you do for a living? I said, I'm in the mining industry. It's like, what do you mine for? Gold, blue sapphires, diamonds? I said, no, something much more valuable than that. I said, what is it? This guy thought I was really loaded. He said, what do you do? I said, no, I mine for young leaders in the most devastated parts of the world, because they have been tried and tested, and these guys have guts, these girls have guts. They are refined, they're resilient, they're inspirational, and they are our nation's best hope. They are our world's best hope, and that is the Phoenix generation. Hope you enjoy, and hope you continue to invest in young people and children. Don't make it an extracurricular side project or your parenting duty. Go beyond. Be a parent to your children's generation. Take the time. They're worth it. And they will change and transform our world. Thank you very much.